but was already dead on his feet when the motorcycles found him. 400 engines, Route 66, a dying girl in the passenger seat, and a boy who hadn't slept in 3 days still refusing to let go of her hand. Nobody at that gas station expected what happened next. The bikers weren't supposed to be the heroes of this story. They were supposed to be the danger. They were wrong. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and ride with us. Every week we bring you stories that will break your chest open and remind you what it means to be human. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Like this video so the next soul who needs it can find it. Now, don't you dare look away. The truck was dying. Elias Mercer could feel it in his hands before he could hear it, a fine tremor running up through the steering wheel like a dying heartbeat. Irregular and wrong. The kind of vibration that every mechanic learns to read like language. He'd spent 6 years under the hoods of other people's vehicles, resurrecting engines that had no business running, and he knew with cold certainty what that tremor meant. The radiator temperature gauge had been creeping toward the red for the last 40 miles. The oil pressure was dropping. The alternator was singing in a high, thin whine that no amount of prayer, if he had any left, was going to fix. He didn't look at the gauge again. He looked at Noelle. His older sister was asleep against the passenger window, her forehead resting on the glass, her breath making small clouds that disappeared almost instantly in the cab's failing air conditioning. She was 26 years old, and she looked 60. The pulmonary fibrosis had done that. Not all at once, but in the way water carves stone, slow and inevitable and merciless. Her cheekbones pressed too close to the surface of her skin now. Her lips were slightly blue at the edges, even in the August heat. She had an oxygen concentrator wedged between her feet on the floorboard, its battery pack wrapped in a dish towel because the casing had cracked somewhere outside Flagstaff, and Elias had been afraid the plastic shards would cut her ankles. She'd told him not to wrap it. He'd done it anyway. That was the whole of their relationship in a single gesture. Her trying to protect him from the effort of caring for her, him refusing to stop. The highway stretched ahead like a wound through the desert. This was the old Route 66 corridor, the part of Arizona that the interstate had tried to swallow and failed, leaving behind sun-bleached motels with empty pools and diners with hand-painted signs and gas stations that existed 40 miles apart from each other, like outposts at the edge of the known world. The afternoon sun hit the asphalt at an angle that turned the road into a mirror. Heat shimmer made the horizon dissolve. Elias had the visor down, and it still wasn't enough. The light was everywhere, coming off the chrome of the passing signs, bouncing up from the white line, filling the cab with a flat, blinding glare that made his eyes ache. He hadn't really slept since Tulsa. That was 3 days ago. 3 days of gas station coffee and convenience store granola bars, and sleeping for 20-minute stretches in rest stop parking lots while Noelle monitored her own oxygen saturation with a pulse oximeter she kept on a lanyard around her neck. She'd wake him the moment his breathing changed. She'd learned to tell the difference between his light sleep and his deep sleep, and she wouldn't let him have the deep kind because she said she needed him alert. What she meant was that she needed him present. What she really meant was that she was terrified of waking up alone. The clinical trial at Phoenix Valley Medical Center was the last door that hadn't been closed in their faces. Elias had spent 8 months watching doors close. First, the local pulmonologist in Medford, who told them the disease progression was too advanced for the standard treatment protocols. Then the insurance company that had denied the experimental medication twice, citing insufficient evidence. And when Elias had called them back, his voice tight and controlled in the way it got when he was working very hard not to break something, the representative had told him to submit an appeal and given him a form number. He'd submitted the appeal. 3 weeks later, they'd denied it again. Same language, same form letter, same signature block at the bottom that might have been stamped by a machine for all the human feeling it contained. Then the hospital in Denver that had a promising trial but required a minimum of 6 months of prior treatment documentation that Noelle didn't have because she'd been uninsured for 2 of the past 3 years. Then the specialist in Albuquerque who'd reviewed her files said the word unfortunate twice and suggested palliative care. Noelle had been very quiet on the drive back from that appointment. She'd watched the desert out the passenger window the whole way and hadn't said anything until they'd pulled into the parking lot of their motel, and then she'd said, very quietly, "I don't want palliative care." Elias had said, "I know." She'd said, "I want to fight." He'd said, "I know that too." They'd sat in the parking lot for a while after that, with the engine off and the heat coming up fast. Phoenix Valley was different. He'd spent 3 weeks emailing, calling, leaving voicemails that went to assistant coordinators who transferred him to intake nurses who transferred him back to coordinators. Until finally a doctor named Vasquez had called him on a Tuesday afternoon while he was elbow deep in a transmission rebuild and had said, carefully, that they had a slot in phase 2 of their fibrosis trial, that Noelle's profile fit their parameters, but that she needed to present in person for initial evaluation within the next 2 weeks, or the slot would go to the next candidate on their list. 2 weeks. 1,500 miles. One truck with 180,000 miles on it and a radiator that had been running hot since March. He'd said yes before the doctor finished the sentence. Now it was day 3, and the truck was talking to him, and what it was saying was not good. He saw the gas station from 2 miles out. The fluorescent sign was visible even in the blazing afternoon light because it was the only vertical thing on the horizon that wasn't a saguaro cactus. Desert Star Fuels. He didn't need gas, but he'd filled up 40 miles back, but the temperature gauge had ticked fully into the red in the last 10 minutes, and he could smell something hot and acrid coming from the engine bay. A smell he recognized as the smell of a water pump that was about to fail catastrophically or had already failed and was just waiting for him to acknowledge it. He took the exit. He heard them before he saw them. The sound hit him like a physical thing, a rolling, layered thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once, too deep and complex to be actual thunder, too rhythmic and purposeful. It built as he turned onto the access road, growing from a background rumble to something that vibrated in his sternum and pressed against his eardrums. Noelle stirred in her sleep. Her hand moved to the pulse oximeter automatically, checking her own numbers without fully waking, a habit so ingrained now. It happened even unconscious. Elias pulled into the gas station and stopped. There were motorcycles everywhere. Not 10, not 20, hundreds. The parking lot of the Desert Star was full, overflowing, bikes lined up in tight, organized rows across the asphalt and spilling out onto the gravel shoulder, chrome and paint and leather, under the August sun, a sea of machines that seemed to go on past what he could see. More were still pulling in from the highway, the convoy stretching back toward the horizon in both directions. Riders in worn leather vests and sun-faded denim, most of them older, faces creased and tanned, moving between the bikes with the easy, deliberate motion of people who have been doing this exact thing for a very long time and have stopped finding it remarkable. The club patches were everywhere, but he couldn't read them at distance, and he wasn't sure it mattered. What mattered was that there were approximately 400 human beings between him and the garage bay door, and his truck was overheating, and his sister needed to be in Phoenix by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. He turned the engine off. The truck shuddered and ticked in the sudden quiet. Quiet being a relative term. Surrounded as he was by the ambient sound of hundreds of idling and cooling motorcycles and the low murmur of hundreds of conversations. Steam was beginning to thread up from the hood seam in thin, pale wisps. He sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel, looking at the parking lot, doing the calculation. Noelle's eyes opened. She turned her head from the window and looked at him, and then looked at the parking lot and was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "That's a lot of motorcycles." "Yeah." "We okay?" He looked at the steam coming off the hood. "The truck needs water." She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him since they were children, like she could read the space between what he said and what he meant, which she could, which she'd always been able to do, which was both her gift and the thing that exhausted him. "How bad?" "I don't know yet." She reached down and checked the concentrator battery without being asked. He watched her do it. The battery indicator showed 40%, which meant roughly 4 hours at her current flow rate, which he'd memorized as automatically as he'd memorized her medication schedule and her oxygen saturation thresholds, and the name of every drug she'd ever been prescribed. "I'll go check," he said. "I'll come with you." "Noelle." "I'm not sitting in a hot truck." Her voice was mild. Final. The voice she used when the conversation was over. He got out first and came around to her side and opened the door and waited while she gathered herself. There was always a gathering, a moment where she organized her breathing and her balance before she moved, a calculation so practiced it was nearly invisible. and then he offered his hand and she took it and stepped down from the cab, and he held the door until she had her footing on the uneven asphalt. She was wearing his flannel shirt over her own because she was always cold, even here, even in 104 degrees of Arizona afternoon. The pulse oximeter lanyard hung around her neck like a talisman. They walked toward the gas station entrance together, and the crowd shifted around them. Not dramatically, not with hostility, but with the unconscious automatic adjustment of a large group of people who suddenly become aware of two figures moving through them who don't belong to their world. Heads turned, eyes followed. The conversations didn't stop, but they changed in pitch and attention, a subtle modulation that Elias felt on the back of his neck like pressure. The man at the fuel pump to his left was built like a fire hydrant, wide and solid and planted, with a gray beard that reached his chest and forearms that belonged on someone twice his size. His vest had a center patch that Elias didn't try to read, and road-worn boots that had seen pavement in a dozen states. He was watching them with flat, dark eyes that held no expression Elias could interpret. Elias didn't look away. He'd learned a long time ago that looking away was the wrong move. They made it to the entrance. Inside, the gas station was small and cool and fluorescent lit. A single attendant behind a counter stacked with sunscreen and road maps and dusty keychains. A woman in her 50s with the look of someone who had been managing the gap between what she expected and what she got for so long that the gap had become her permanent expression. She looked at Elias. She looked at Noel. She looked at the parking lot full of motorcycles visible through the plate glass window. "Help you?" she said, in the tone of someone who was hoping the answer would be no. "My truck's overheating. I need to check the coolant level and probably add water. That okay?" She looked at him for a beat too long. "We got a hose out back. You need to buy something." He bought 2 bottles of water and a bag of mixed nuts and handed her a 10 that he could not afford and pocketed the minimal change and took Noel's arm and went back outside. The sun hit him like a door. He could feel the heat radiating up from the asphalt through the soles of his boots. He needed to pop the hood and let the engine cool before he could safely check the radiator. That meant waiting. 15 minutes, minimum, in a parking lot full of bikers in the August heat, with Noel's oxygen concentrator on 40% battery and an appointment in Phoenix that was 14 hours away. He found a strip of shade on the side wall of the station and guided Noel to it, and she leaned against the brick without complaint. He crouched beside the truck's front bumper and put his hand near the hood and could feel the heat radiating off the metal from 2 inches away. "You should eat something," Noel said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You haven't eaten since that gas station in Winslow." "That was this morning." "That was yesterday morning." He looked up at her. She looked back at him with the specific, tired patience of someone who has had this argument 100 times and knows exactly how it ends. He opened the bag of mixed nuts and put a handful in his mouth and chewed without tasting them. "Elias." "Yeah. If the truck is, I'll figure it out. If we can't make it, we're going to make it. I need you to hear me. Noel." His voice came out harder than he meant it to. He felt it immediately. The way she went slightly still, not flinching, but absorbing. He breathed. "I hear you. We're going to make it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the desert. Then she looked at the parking lot full of motorcycles and the riders moving between them and the afternoon light dropping in long, hard angles across all of it. And she said very quietly, "They're watching us." He turned. She was right. Not all of them, not obviously. But there was a quality to the attention in the parking lot that had shifted in the last few minutes. A gravitational pull, subtle and unmistakable. A kind of awareness that Elias recognized from his years in auto shops and roadside stops. The particular attention that a crowd pays to something it has decided might be significant. 3 riders near the nearest pump had stopped their conversation. The man with the gray beard hadn't moved from his position, but his orientation had changed, angled slightly toward them rather than toward the highway. A younger rider, 25 maybe, with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, was leaning against a chrome tank with his arms crossed, watching them with an expression that wasn't hostile and wasn't friendly and was something else entirely that Elias couldn't categorize. He stood up from his crouch. The temperature inside his chest dropped several degrees. "Stay here," he said. "Elias, just—" He put his hand on her shoulder briefly, and she covered it with her own, and then he moved away from the wall and toward the hood of the truck. He moved with his shoulders square and his pace unhurried because he'd grown up poor in a neighborhood where showing fear was an invitation and old reflexes die hard. He put his hand on his hood latch, and it was still too hot, but he could live with that. And he pulled it, and the hood rose and the steam hit him. Not a full blowout, not a catastrophic failure, but a significant release of pressure and vapor that meant the coolant level was critically low, and the water pump was either dead or very close to it. He stood there looking at the engine and doing the math, and the math was not good. The water pump wasn't a roadside fix. It was a garage fix, a lift fix, a 2 to 3 hour fix even if you had the parts, which he didn't. The nearest town with a parts store was 32 miles back the way he'd come. He had $67 left in his wallet and a debit card connected to an account that had $19 in it because he'd given the rest to the pharmacy that filled Noelle's last prescription. And Noelle's last prescription had been expensive in the way that all of her medications were expensive, in the way that everything connected to keeping her alive was expensive, a grinding, relentless expense that had consumed his savings and his emergency fund and then his credit and then everything else, one bill at a time, until there was nothing left but forward motion. He heard footsteps on the asphalt behind him. Heavy, unhurried, the sound of boots that weren't in a rush. He turned. The man who'd approached was older, mid-60s maybe, though built in a way that made the age seem abstract, like a number applied to a material that hadn't actually aged. 6'2", heavy through the shoulders, hair gone fully silver and worn slightly long, tied back with a thin leather cord. His face was a topographic map of American highway miles, deeply lined, sun-darkened, marked by something that wasn't age so much as accumulation. Accumulation of what? Elias didn't yet know. His vest was older than most of the bikes in the parking lot, the leather soft and dark with years of handling, the patches faded to a kind of dignity. The center patch read Iron Covenant MC. The top rocker read Arizona. The president patch was small and centered below the main patch. He stopped 6 feet away. His hands were loose at his sides. He didn't crowd the space. He looked at the engine for a moment. Then he looked at Elias. His voice, when it came, was low. The voice of a man who had learned to talk under the sound of engines. Water pump? Elias studied him for a long beat. Yeah. The man looked at the engine again. He tilted his head slightly. Professional assessment. The look that Elias recognized because he wore it himself. Then he looked at Noelle, still in the strip of shade against the wall, and his gaze didn't linger, but it recorded everything. The oxygen concentrator, the flannel shirt, the way she was standing with one hand flat against the brick for balance. He looked back at Elias. Where you headed? Phoenix. When you need to be there? Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. The man was quiet for a moment. He looked at the horizon and something moved behind his eyes. Something old and complicated that came and went before Elias could read it. Then he looked back at the engine. You're not going to make it on that water pump, he said. It wasn't unkind. It was the kind of factual statement that a man makes when he respects you enough to tell you the truth. I know that, Elias said. So what are you going to do? Elias looked at the engine. He looked at Noelle. He looked at the $67 in his wallet and the $19 in his account, and the water pump that was either dead or dying, and the clinical trial appointment that was the last door in the world that was still open. He had no answer. For the first time in 3 days of forward motion, of refusing to stop or turn around or consider the possibility that this could end anyway but the one he'd decided it would end, he had no answer. Something happened to his knees. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the collapse of a man who has given up. It was the collapse of a man who has been running on empty for so long that he's been burning the structural material, and the structural material has finally run out. He went down slowly, one knee and then the other, onto the hot asphalt beside the front bumper of the truck, and even as he went down, his right hand reached back and found Noelle's arm. She'd moved without him hearing her, was standing right behind him, had put herself there without being asked because she always knew. She always somehow knew. And he held on. He didn't let go. The parking lot went very still. 400 bikers, conversations half finished, engines idling or silent, all of it suspended in the particular held breath quality of a crowd that has witnessed something that it doesn't yet have a category for. The heat came up off the asphalt in waves. Someone's radio was playing something far away, barely audible. A country song with too much steel guitar and a voice that sounded like gravel and regret. The man with silver hair hadn't moved. He looked down at Elias on the asphalt, still holding his sister's arm, still not letting go. And something in his expression changed. It wasn't pity. It was something older than pity and quieter. He turned his head slightly and said one word, not loud, to the nearest group of riders. A single word that Elias couldn't quite hear. But the nearest riders heard it, and they moved, and for one terrible suspended second, as boots began to sound on asphalt from every direction, as the crowd in the parking lot shifted and oriented and contracted toward the truck and the boy on the pavement and the woman in the flannel shirt, Elias didn't know. Couldn't know. Whether what was coming toward them was help or the last, worst thing in a string of last, worse things. He held his sister's arm tighter, and he waited. The boots came from every direction, not running. That was the first thing Elias registered. They weren't running, weren't rushing, weren't the sound of men closing in with urgency or aggression. They were walking, measured and deliberate, the way men walk when they've already decided something, and the decision is calm. Boot leather on hot asphalt, dozens of pairs, the rhythm overlapping and building into something that vibrated up through Elias's knees where they pressed against the ground. He didn't move. He kept his hand locked around Noelle's wrist, and he didn't move. She put her free hand on his shoulder, not pulling him up, just there. The silver-haired man, the president, the patches said, though Elias hadn't fully processed that yet, crouched down to his level, not looming, not standing over him in the way that men stand over other men when they want to establish something. He came down to the asphalt with the careful movement of a man whose knees had their own history, and he put his forearms on his thighs and looked at Elias from the same height. Up close, his eyes were gray, not cold gray, the gray of old rivers. "Name's Gideon," he said. "You don't have to get up yet." Elias stared at him. His chest was doing something complicated, some internal rearrangement that he didn't have language for, and he was aware of it the way you're aware of a sound in the walls at night, present and unexplained and requiring a response he hadn't figured out yet. "Elias," he said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. Gideon nodded once. He looked at Noelle. "Ma'am, you doing all right standing?" Noelle's hand was still on Elias's shoulder. "I'm fine," she said, in the tone she used when she was managing something. "Thank you." Gideon looked at the oxygen concentrator hanging from her other hand. He looked at the battery indicator without pointing at it. He looked back at Elias. "How long has she been on supplemental O2? Elias felt his jaw tighten. 8 months. Flow rate. 2 liters. Gideon absorbed this the way a man absorbs information he's going to use, not just acknowledge. He turned his head slightly and said, "Mason." Not loud. The word traveled anyway. The man who appeared from the crowd was younger than Gideon by about 15 years, early 50s, compact and economical in his movements, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, and hands that moved with the particular careful precision of someone trained to do specific things with them. He was carrying a water bottle and what looked like a soft-sided medical kit, already unzipped. He looked at Noelle first. "Former Army medic," he said by way of introduction to Elias. "Mason Creed. I'm not going to touch her without her permission." Noelle looked at him. Something passed between them. The particular assessment that passes between people who have both spent significant time in medical contexts, who recognize each other's fluency in that language. "What do you want to check?" she said. "Sat levels, respiratory rate, how you're tolerating the heat." He paused. "You've been in a truck without working AC. That's not nothing." "The AC works," Elias said. Mason looked at him with the expression of a man who is going to be kind about this. "Son, the AC is blowing about 68 degrees, in 104 ambient. That's not working." Elias opened his mouth and closed it again. Noelle said, "You can check." Mason moved to her with quiet efficiency. He had a pulse oximeter in his kit, better than hers, a clinical model rather than a consumer one, and he clipped it to her finger and watched the numbers and didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the screen with that precise, reading face. He pressed 2 fingers gently to her wrist and counted without appearing to count. Gideon was still crouched in front of Elias. "You need to stand up," he said. It wasn't harsh. It was the voice of a man who has seen what happens when people stay on the ground too long. Elias stood up. His legs felt wrong, like the bones had been replaced with something denser and less cooperative, but he stood. Gideon rose with him, and up at full height, he was taller than Elias had gauged, broad in the way that men get broad when they've been physical their entire lives, and the muscle has settled into something permanent and structural. "Tell me about the truck," Gideon said. "Water pump's gone. Or going. I can hear it in the belt tension, and the coolant's been disappearing faster than any leak I can find from outside, which means it's internal." Elias heard himself talking like a mechanic, because that was the ground under him, the one thing that didn't shift. "I need the pump replaced and probably a thermostat check and a full coolant flush. 3 hours minimum with the right parts." "You do the work yourself?" "I'm a mechanic." "Where?" "Medford, Oklahoma. Tillman's Auto." Gideon looked at the truck with the same professional attention Mason had given Noel. He walked to the front, put his hand near the hood the way Elias had done, gauged the heat. He leaned down and looked under the front end without touching anything and stood back up. "Bobby," he said, toward the crowd. 2 men detached from the periphery. One was in his late 40s with grease already on his hands, despite the fact that he'd apparently been standing in a gas station parking lot, which told Elias something about how he spent most of his time. The other was younger, maybe 30, with the kind of rangy build that's deceptive. Looks light until you see him move and realize the weight is all in the right places. "Water pump," Gideon said to Bobby. "Full coolant, thermostat while you're in there. What else you see?" Bobby crouched and looked under the truck for about 4 seconds. He straightened. "Belt's cracked. Needs a new belt." "Parts run," Gideon said. Bobby and the younger man were already moving toward one of the bikes before Gideon finished the sentence. Elias watched this happen. The efficiency of it, the absence of discussion or deliberation, the way the club moved like a single organism making a decision that had already been made. It was disorienting in a way that he couldn't immediately process, like watching the laws of physics operate differently than he'd been taught they did. He said, "Wait." Gideon looked at him. "I can't pay for the parts." The words came out flat and factual and cost him something to say. "Not right now. I've got $67 and the account is at 19. I can't." He held Gideon's gaze because looking away would have been worse. "I appreciate what you're trying to do. I do. But I can't take charity, I can't repay, and I don't know you and I don't know what this is." The parking lot around them had gone very quiet. Not silent. There were still engines and the ambient noise of 400 people in close proximity. But the quality of the quiet around this specific conversation was the quiet of people listening without appearing to listen. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. "You know what charity is?" he said. Elias didn't answer. "Charity is when somebody gives something because it makes them feel better about themselves." Gideon's voice was even. "This isn't that." He looked at the truck. He looked at Noel, who was watching this exchange with the pulse oximeter still on her finger and Mason standing quietly to her side. He looked back at Elias. "We're going to fix your truck. The parts are getting bought. You can stand here and argue with me about it, or you can let Mason get your sister somewhere cool, and you can tell Bobby what you know about this engine." Elias stared at him. "Those are the options," Gideon said. The silence between them was the silence of 2 people who understand each other's stubbornness because they share the same variety of it. Elias could feel Noel's eyes on the side of his face. He could feel the weight of the appointment, the weight of the water pump, the weight of the $67 and the 19 in the account and the 8 months of doors closing. "Why?" he said. "Because you need help," Gideon said, "and we're here." He paused. "That's all." It was the simplest answer anyone had given him in 8 months. It was also somehow the one he trusted least, which told him something about what the last 8 months had done to his ability to receive simple answers. He looked at the truck. He looked at Bobby's retreating motorcycle, already pulling out of the lot onto the highway. He looked at his sister. She gave him the look. The quiet, final, let someone help us look that she'd been giving him since Tulsa, and he'd been refusing since Tulsa. "What do you need to know about the engine?" he said to the man standing behind Gideon, who hadn't been introduced yet, but had a grease-stained notebook in his hand. They set up a tarp off the side wall of the station using bungee cords and 2 tent poles that appeared from somewhere in a saddlebag, creating a strip of shade maybe 8 feet wide that caught the angle of the afternoon sun and blocked it. Someone, Elias didn't see who, appeared with a folding chair. Someone else appeared with a second one. Noelle sat in the shade with Mason crouched beside her, and a cooler that had been materialized from the back of a truck at the edge of the lot, filled with ice and water bottles. Elias stood at the open hood of his truck and talked to the unnamed mechanic, who turned out to be named Dex, short for something he didn't offer, through everything he knew, the history of the cooling system, when he'd last changed the thermostat, what the oil had looked like at the last change, the particular sound the belt had been making for the past week that he hadn't had the time or money to address. Dex wrote in his notebook with a stub of pencil and asked 2 questions and didn't ask any others, and Elias found, to his mild shock, that the man actually knew what he was talking about. While they talked, the parking lot around them continued its life. Riders refueling, conversations happening in knots of 2 and 3, the rumble of bikes pulling in and pulling out. But there was a perimeter, not enforced, not visible in any formal way, just a natural space that had opened up around the tarp and the truck and the 2 people at the center of it, a buffer that the other riders maintained without being asked to maintain it, moving around the edges rather than through. Elias noticed it at about the 15-minute mark. He noticed it and then noticed himself noticing it and filed it somewhere. The gas station attendant came out at 20 minutes. She was the same woman from inside, the one with the tired expression who'd made him buy something before she'd let him use the hose. She was carrying a cardboard box, and she set it on the edge of the folding table that had also appeared from somewhere. Sandwiches. Wrapped in white paper, the kind from a deli counter. Chips. More water. She caught Elias looking at her. "Owner called in," she said without preamble. He said. She gestured at the box. "So." She went back inside. Elias didn't touch the food. Noelle said from under the tarp, "Elias." "I'm fine." "You're not eating again." "I said I'm fine." Mason, without looking up from the blood pressure cuff he was applying to Noelle's arm, said, "Son, eat the sandwich." The way he said it was so devoid of drama, so completely matter-of-fact, that Elias found himself picking up a sandwich before he'd consciously decided to. He stood by the front bumper of the truck and ate it, and it was turkey, and it was the best thing he'd tasted in 3 days, and he hated that it was the best thing he'd tasted in 3 days because it was a gas station sandwich from a cardboard box given to him by strangers, and he was not the kind of person who ate charity sandwiches. Apparently he was exactly that kind of person. He finished the sandwich and crushed the wrapper in his fist and looked at the horizon. Gideon appeared beside him. He'd been gone for the last 20 minutes. Elias had tracked his absence without quite meaning to, and he had 2 cups of coffee, one of which he held out. Black, from the station inside. The cup was the styrofoam kind that burned your fingers if you held it wrong. Elias took it. They stood at the front of the truck together and drank coffee and didn't speak for a while. The sun had moved enough that the angle of the light had shifted, cutting lower and harder across the lot, turning the chrome on the assembled Harleys into a field of small, sharp lights. "How long has she been sick?" Gideon said. "Diagnosed 14 months ago. Symptomatic longer than that. She was having trouble breathing for almost a year before she went to the doctor." Elias looked at his coffee cup. "She didn't tell me about the breathing trouble. She was trying to protect me." "Older sisters do that." "You have one?" Something happened in Gideon's face. A compression, brief and controlled, the kind of expression that's not quite suppressed but is managed carefully. Had, he said. "Long time ago." Elias absorbed this. He didn't offer condolences because something about Gideon's tone made it clear that condolences were not the appropriate currency here. "The trial in Phoenix," Gideon said. "It's legitimate? You've verified it?" "I've talked to the lead researcher 4 times. I've read every published study on the medication. I have the consent forms." Elias looked at him. "I'm not walking my sister into a situation I haven't checked. I've checked everything." "I believe you." "I don't need you to believe me." "No," Gideon agreed. "You don't." The coffee was terrible and too hot, and Elias drank it anyway because his hands needed something to do. "What is this rally?" he said. It came out blunter than he intended. "What are 400 bikes doing on Route 66 in August?" Gideon looked at the assembled bikes. His expression shifted into something that wasn't quite pride but lived in the same neighborhood. "Annual run. We do it every year since 2003. Route 66 from Albuquerque to the California border. Different clubs, different states, same road. He paused. We started it for a reason. We keep doing it for the same reason. What reason? Gideon looked at him. We lost someone on this road. 1997, brother of mine. He was coming home from his daughter's graduation and a semi ran him off the highway outside Kingman. He said it the way people say things they've said many times, not without feeling, but with the feeling in a specific contained place. He'd have been 61 this year. Elias didn't say anything. The run's in his name, Gideon said. We stop at the mile marker every time. It's just what we do. They stood in silence for a moment. The desert heat pressed down on them both equally, indifferent to grief or gratitude or any other human arrangement. Then a bike came back into the lot. Bobby. Moving faster than was strictly advisable in a parking lot full of people and equipment, which meant he had news. He pulled up and killed the engine and came off the bike in one motion and held up a parts bag. Water pump, belt, thermostat, filter. They had everything. He handed the bag to Dex, who was already moving toward the truck. Also, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Guy at the counter recognized the truck. Said a 98 F-150 with an Oklahoma plate came in 3 days ago asking about water pump replacement. Said the kid couldn't pay, so he wrote up the quote and told him to come back when he had the money. He held out the paper. Elias took it. He unfolded it. It was an estimate from a shop in Amarillo. $412. His name was at the top. The date was 3 days ago, which was the day they'd come through Amarillo. He'd stopped at a shop in Amarillo. He remembered it. The guy had been okay about it, hadn't been unkind, had actually apologized, said he couldn't do the work on credit for someone he didn't know. Elias had thanked him and gotten back in the truck and told Noelle the water pump was fine, they'd be okay. He'd heard the sound before and it wasn't as bad as it seemed. He hadn't told her he'd stopped. He hadn't told her any of it. He stood holding the estimate and stared at it for longer than was necessary. Elias, Noelle's voice from under the tarp. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. I'm good. She was quiet. He didn't look at her. You stopped in Amarillo, she said. Not a question. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The styrofoam made a small sound. Yeah. You told me the pump was fine. I know what I told you. The silence under the tarp was a specific kind of silence, the kind that accumulates around a specific kind of lie, not a malicious lie. Not a self-serving lie, but the kind told by someone who believes that keeping another person from worry is the same as protecting them, which it isn't, which he'd known even when he told it. Mason had gone very still and very professionally uninvolved. Noelle said, How many other things? Noelle, how many other things did you decide I didn't need to know? Her voice was level. That was always the worst version of her voice. Not raised, not broken, just level and tired and very precise. He'd heard it twice before. Once, when he'd hidden the first round of medical bills from her, and once when she'd found out he'd sold his truck to pay for her second specialist, and been driving a borrowed vehicle for 6 weeks without telling her. He'd told himself both times that he was protecting her. She'd told him both times that he was protecting himself. He turned to face her. She was sitting in the folding chair with the oxygen concentrator running at her feet, and her eyes were very clear and very tired, and she was looking at him with the expression of someone who loves another person completely and is also, in this moment, very close to the end of something. The check engine light, he said. It came on outside Joplin. I cleared the code. It was the coolant temp sensor. It was throwing a false reading, or I told myself it was a false reading. It came back on outside Tulsa. I cleared it again. She absorbed this. The noise the belt was making, he continued. I heard it in Amarillo, and I stopped at the shop and the guy told me $400, and I didn't have $400 and I drove away. I told you the pump was fine. What else? The tire pressure on the rear passenger side has been low since Oklahoma City. I've been adding air at every stop. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to add another thing to... He stopped. To my list, she said. To your worry, he said. My worry, she repeated. She said it like she was tasting it, finding it insufficient. Elias, I have pulmonary fibrosis. My worry is already at capacity. You telling me the belt is making a noise doesn't add to my worry. You lying to me about the belt adds to my worry. Do you understand that? He did. He'd always understood it. Understanding something and being able to stop doing it were different categories. I didn't want you to decide to turn back, he said. And there it was. The real thing, underneath all of it, the one he hadn't said out loud. I was afraid if I told you everything that was wrong, you'd tell me to take you home. And I can't take you home. I can't take you home and watch you. His voice did something he didn't intend. He stopped, controlled it. I need you to get to Phoenix. I need this to work. And I was afraid that if you knew how bad the truck was, you'd try to protect me by giving up, she said quietly. He didn't answer. She was quiet for a very long time. The afternoon light shifted. Someone's Harley started up somewhere in the lot, ran for a moment, and shut down again. I'm not going to give up, she said. I told you in the Albuquerque parking lot. I meant it then. I mean it now. She looked at her hands. But I need you to stop making decisions for me. I'm still here. My lungs are failing, not my mind. I get to know the truth of my own situation. Okay, he said. That's not enough. Okay, he said again, and this time he meant the different thing, the thing underneath. The acknowledgement not just of this moment, but of the pattern. The 8 months of careful concealment he'd told himself was love, and she'd told him was control, and they were both right. Gideon had drifted several feet away during this exchange. He was not pretending not to have heard it. The distance was too small for that. But he'd angled himself away from them in the specific manner of a man who is present and not intervening and giving the space its dignity. Now he drifted back. He looked at Elias and said nothing. Elias said, I owe you. You don't. I'll figure out a way to repay. Son. Gideon's voice was still level. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it. He looked at the desert for a moment, the long, flat spread of it going bronze in the shifting afternoon. 1971, Route 66 going the other direction toward Texas. I was 23 years old, and I was coming home from 2 tours, and I had $6 and a motorcycle that was dropping oil and a drinking problem that I hadn't named yet. He paused. Pulled into a gas station outside Seligman. Engine seized. I sat on the gravel, and I didn't get up for a while. Elias watched him. Man came out of the station, not a biker, just a man. Gas station owner, about 60. He looked at me and the bike, and he went back inside and he came out with a case of oil and a sandwich, and he called a buddy who had a machine shop, and between the two of them, they got the bike running in 4 hours. Gideon looked at his hands. I asked him how much. He said, when you find the person who needs it more than you, pay it there. The silence was thick and full of something. I've been paying it there for 50 years, Gideon said. You're not a charity case. You're the place where it's owed. Elias's jaw was very tight. He looked at the ground. There was a crack in the asphalt near his boot, running in a long diagonal line toward the shadow of the truck. I don't know how to do this, he said. His voice was lower. Except this. I don't know how to let people... He stopped. I know, Gideon said. Most men don't. They learn or they don't. The sound of ratchets and impact drivers started up from under the truck, where Dex and 2 other riders had set up under a rolling creeper they'd appeared with from somewhere. Professional. Methodical. The sound of men who know exactly what they're doing and are doing it. Mason appeared at Elias's shoulder. He had a second cup of coffee that Elias hadn't asked for and didn't refuse. Sat's at 93, Mason said. I want to get that up before you put her back in the vehicle. What do you need? She needs cool air and less talking in about 20 minutes. I've got a portable nebulizer in my kit and a saline neb that'll help. Has she eaten today? Elias stopped. He turned to look at his sister. She was eating one of the sandwiches from the box. She met his eye and raised the sandwich slightly, an I told you so gesture that required no additional words. He turned back. She's eating now. Good. Mason drank his own coffee. How about you? And don't say you're fine. Elias was going to say he was fine. He reconsidered. I'm running on nothing and I know it. When did you last actually sleep? Rest stop outside Amarillo. 40 minutes. Mason looked at him with the patient expression of a man who has dealt with soldiers and riders, and any number of humans who treat their own bodies as equipment to be run until failure. You're going to have a problem if you put that girl in a truck tonight and try to drive on 40 minutes of sleep. I have to. We need to be in Phoenix by... I know when you need to be there. Mason looked at the sky. The sun was maybe 4 hours from the horizon. Work on the truck's going to take 3 hours minimum. After that, you've got, he did the math, a little under 2 hours to Phoenix if you push it. You've got time for 2 hours of sleep before you need to leave. I can't sleep here. Why not? Elias looked at this parking lot. The 400 bikes, the riders, the tarp, the folding chairs, the cardboard box of sandwiches, the mechanic under his truck, the old man with silver hair who had 5 decades of a story he'd just finished telling. I don't know these people, he said. The words sounded different out loud than they had in his head. Mason looked at him. No, he said. You don't. He let that sit for a moment. Question is whether that matters. He didn't sleep, not right away. He sat under the tarp while Noelle had her nebulizer treatment and the sun dropped another hand width toward the horizon and the sound of work came from under the truck, steady and professional and purposeful. Other riders drifted past on errands he couldn't always identify. Someone appeared with a case of power bars. Someone appeared with a phone charger that fit his particular cable type. Someone sat down at the edge of the tarp without introduction and started talking to Noelle about wildflowers in the Sonoran desert, in a way that was so specifically ordinary that it took Elias several minutes to realize it was deliberate, that the man had found a topic so far from illness and trials and failing trucks that it gave Noelle a place to exist that wasn't the center of a crisis. He watched all of this happen and couldn't make it fit any framework he had for how the world operated. He'd grown up in a version of the world where help had conditions, where gas station owners in Amarillo wrote estimates you couldn't pay and wished you luck, where insurance companies sent form letters and hospitals required documentation, and specialists used words like unfortunate and palliative in voices designed to close conversations, where help, when it came wrapped in obligation and expectation and the implicit understanding that you would owe something, were already owing something, were defined at least in part by what you owed. This was different, and it made him suspicious in the way that anything sufficiently different from experience makes a person suspicious. And the suspicion sat in his chest alongside something else he hadn't identified yet. He was on his second cup of terrible gas station coffee when the trouble started. It didn't announce itself. It didn't come with warning or noise or visible aggression. It came as a shift in the energy of the lot. The kind of shift that Elias, who'd grown up in small spaces where tension could turn fast, had developed sensitivity to the way some people develop sensitivity to barometric pressure. A subtle change in the quality of movement around the far end of the parking lot, near the highway entrance, where 2 men had stopped their bikes and were not dismounting in the usual way. They were watching. Not the casual, drifting attention that the rest of the crowd had given the truck and the tarp and the siblings. Watching with direction, watching with something specific in mind. Elias tracked them without moving his head. One of them he'd seen before, or thought he had. Bigger than most of the other riders, with a vest that had different patches that didn't match the Iron Covenant configuration, a center patch he couldn't read from this distance. The second man was leaner, younger, with the specific stillness of someone who has been trained to move fast and is currently choosing not to. They weren't making trouble. They weren't doing anything he could point to. They were just there, at the edge of the lot, watching the tarp and the truck, and specifically, he was almost certain, watching Noelle. He looked for Gideon. He found him near the road entrance, also watching the 2 men. The conversation between Gideon and the 2 riders, when it happened, was too far away for Elias to hear. He watched the body language instead. Gideon was relaxed on the surface and not relaxed underneath. He could read that from 40 feet, the deliberate looseness in the shoulders that was the opposite of actual looseness, the stance that kept his weight centered. The bigger man said something. Gideon responded. The bigger man looked at the tarp, at Noelle, and said something else. Gideon turned his head slightly and caught Elias's eye. The look lasted half a second. Then Gideon looked back at the 2 riders. Elias stood up. Mason appeared at his elbow without sound. Sit down. Who are they? Sit down. Mason, that's being handled. Mason's voice was quiet and absolute. Sit down and don't give them a reason to escalate this into something it doesn't need to be. What is it? Mason looked at him for a moment, then he looked at the ground. There's a club that doesn't like us using this stretch of 66. Has been an issue for a while. 2 clubs, 1 road, different ideas about territory. He looked at Noel, who was watching the conversation at the entrance with the alert, careful attention of someone who misses very little. It's nothing to do with you. If it's happening 20 feet from my sister, it's something to do with me. I understand that. Mason put a hand on his arm, not restraining, just grounding. And I'm telling you that Gideon has handled versions of this situation for 30 years, and he doesn't need you adding a variable. Elias stood very still. The muscles in his forearms were tight. He looked at the two riders. He looked at Gideon. He looked at the two riders again. How long has this been going on? He said. Between your club and them. Mason was quiet for a beat too long. Mason. Long enough that there's history, Mason said. The kind of history that makes situations like this delicate. What kind of history? Mason looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes that was careful and old and carrying more weight than this moment. There was an incident 4 years ago on this road during the run. He paused. A young rider, 24. He was riding sweep at the back of the convoy, and he got separated in the dark outside Seligman. He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The gap where the end of the sentence should have been was loud enough. Elias looked at Gideon standing at the entrance of the parking lot, talking to two men who belonged to whatever club had been on this road 4 years ago, and something realigned in his understanding of what this rally was and why these specific men rode this specific road every year, and what it cost them to do it, and what it cost Gideon specifically, standing there in the late afternoon light, with his shoulders deliberately loose, and his weight centered and his gray eyes carrying 50 years of accumulated knowing. He sat back down. At the entrance, the conversation continued for another 4 minutes. Then the two riders mounted their bikes and pulled back out onto the highway, and didn't look back. Gideon walked back across the lot. He stopped at the edge of the tarp, looked at Elias, looked at Mason. It's fine, he said. Who were they? Elias asked. Gideon looked at him. People from the past, he said. They come around sometimes. They don't stay. It was a non-answer. Elias knew it was a non-answer, and Gideon knew he knew, and neither of them pushed on it, because there are some histories that belong to the people who lived them, and don't owe explanation to anyone who walked in on the second act. But Elias had heard what Mason hadn't finished saying, and he filed it in the place where he kept things that weren't finished yet. He slept. He hadn't planned to. He'd sat back in the folding chair with his third cup of terrible coffee going cold in his hand, and he'd closed his eyes for what he intended to be 5 minutes, and the sound of the wrenches and the low murmur of conversation and the ambient hum of the desert in the late afternoon had done something to the rigid, exhausted thing he'd been holding himself into for 3 days, and he had gone down fast and completely, the way a structural failure goes. Not gradually, all at once. He dreamed about his mother's kitchen in Medford, the specific yellow of the linoleum floor, Noel at the counter making coffee. He dreamed it with the hyper-real clarity of the very exhausted, every detail pressed in hard. The sound of the coffee maker, the smell of it, the way the morning light came through the window above the sink and turned the steam gold. He woke up to Noel's hand on his shoulder. The light was different, lower, redder. His neck hurt. They're done, Noel said. He stood up. His body was angry about the chair and the angle and the 3 days before it, but it was the anger of something that had been given a minimal resource and was objecting to its minimalism rather than the complete depletion of before. He'd slept 2 hours. He could feel it. The edge was still there, the exhaustion was still there, but the edge had been taken off, like something honed down from a crisis into a condition. He walked around to the front of the truck. Dex was closing the hood. The other two riders were packing up the tools with the methodical efficiency of people who've done it 1,000 times. The asphalt under the engine had been cleaned. Someone had put down shop rags and picked them up again, and the oil stains that had been there were still there, but the fresh mess was gone. Fire it up, Dex said. Elias got in the truck. He held the key for a moment, aware of the specific fear of the moment when the test comes, the moment between not knowing and knowing that can only go one of two ways. He turned the key. The engine caught, ran, smooth. The temperature gauge came up to normal and stayed there. The oil pressure was solid. The belt ran silent. He sat in the cab listening to his truck run and felt something move through him that he didn't have a clean word for. He got back out. How much were the parts? He said to Dex. Covered, Dex said. Tell me how much. Dex looked at him with the expression of a man who has been told not to answer that question. It's covered, he said again. That's all I've got for you. Elias turned to find Gideon. Gideon was standing at the edge of the tarp with his arms crossed and the look of a man who is prepared for this exact argument. Elias opened his mouth. Gideon said, Don't. I'm going to pay you back. Every cent. I need you to tell me. You want to pay something back, Gideon said. You know how to do that. Same way I did. Same way we all did. His voice wasn't harsh. It was certain. Someone else. Someday. You'll know them when you see them because they'll be sitting on the asphalt next to a truck that's dying and they won't know how to stand up yet. Elias stood with his fists closed at his sides. Then he looked at Noelle, who was standing beside Mason with the concentrator running and her oxygen saturation. Mason had been checking it every 30 minutes, at 96%, the highest it had been since Tulsa. He looked back at Gideon. My sister, he started, and didn't know how to finish the sentence, and Gideon held up one hand slightly. Not a stop, not a dismissal, just an acknowledgement that he didn't need the sentence finished. Get her to Phoenix, Gideon said. Elias nodded. He went to get Noelle's bag from under the tarp. He was picking it up when his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. He didn't recognize the number. He answered it. The voice on the other end was efficient, professional, and not unkind. It identified itself as the intake coordinator at Phoenix Valley Medical Center. It was calling, the voice said, to confirm tomorrow's appointment for Noelle Mercer. There was a pause, and then the voice said, I also need to let you know that we received notification from our insurance verification team this morning. I'm sorry to tell you this, but your sister's insurance policy doesn't cover participation in the clinical trial. The out-of-pocket participation cost for the initial evaluation phase is $7,800. The desert light went flat. That would need to be paid, the voice said carefully, before we can begin evaluation. $7,800. Elias stood beside his running truck with the phone against his ear and the afternoon going red around him, and 400 motorcycles cooling in the lot, and his fixed, running, carefully repaired truck idling smooth and steady, and he did the only calculation that mattered. $67 in his wallet, $19 in the account, $0 anywhere else. Mr. Mercer, the voice said, are you there? He was there. But he had no idea, in that moment, how he was going to stay there. How any of this, the truck and the bikers and the careful repairs and the sandwiches and the 2 hours of sleep, how any of it mattered at all against the specific, final $7,800 weight of a wall he had absolutely no way through. The first call Elias made was to a number he'd memorized 3 years ago and never expected to use. Danny Rice had been 2 years ahead of him at Medford High, the kind of kid who took apart his mother's desktop computer at age 12 and put it back together better than it had been, who'd gotten a scholarship to Oklahoma State for computer science and had come back to Medford afterward. Not because he couldn't go elsewhere, but because he said the elsewhere wasn't interesting and Medford was, which was an assessment that nobody else in Medford shared, but which Danny held with the serene confidence of someone who has decided their own opinion is the relevant one. He ran IT support for 3 businesses in town and spent his evenings doing things on the internet that he described, when asked, as research, and which Elias had never pressed him on because the results of the research occasionally solved problems that had no other solution. He answered on the second ring. It's Elias. I know it's Elias. It's your number. I need something and I need it fast. A pause, the sound of a chair moving. How fast? Tonight. Another pause, longer. What kind of something? Traffic and commercial security camera footage from a stretch of Route 66 outside Kingman, Arizona, October 14, 2022, between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Elias was walking as he talked, moving to the far edge of the tarp where his voice wouldn't carry across the lot. The desert cold hit him fully out here, the kind of cold that comes up from the ground after dark in high desert, and his breath made small clouds in the fluorescent wash. Specifically, any cameras on or adjacent to the highway between mile markers 44 and 52. Danny was quiet for 4 seconds. That's specific. I know what I need. This about something I want to know about? Probably not. Okay. The sound of keys. Fast. Danny typed the way he did everything. with complete commitment and no wasted motion. I can pull public records requests for any DOT cameras in that corridor, but those take time I don't think you have. Commercial security. That's different. That depends on whether any businesses on that stretch still have footage archived that far back, which is a long shot on 4-year-old data. There's a trailer facility, Elias said. He was working from memory now, from what the larger Reaper had said to Gideon. Someone had a camera on a trailer cam outside Kingman. And from his knowledge of how Route 66 runs through that part of Mojave County, which he'd been studying on his phone during the hours under the tarp, because the road they were driving was the road they were on, and he'd needed something to do with his mind. Storage facilities on that highway. They run security for insurance purposes. The footage retention on commercial security systems is typically 30 to 90 days unless there's a reason to archive it longer. Which means someone archived the Reaper's footage specifically, Danny said. He caught it immediately. That was what Elias needed him for. Which means it exists because someone made it exist, Elias said. Which means the original footage stream from that date still exists in whatever system captured it, because you don't pull a clip without the source being somewhere. Find me the storage facilities on that corridor. Find me their security vendors. Find me the vendors' archive infrastructure. Elias. Danny's voice was careful. Some of what you're asking me to do, I know, is not exactly within the lines. I know that too. A longer pause. Keys again, slower this time. The sound of deliberation rather than execution. You've got something worth doing this for. It wasn't a question. Danny had known him long enough to know the register his voice took when he was operating from something that mattered. Yeah, Elias said. Okay. The keys resumed faster than before. Give me 90 minutes. I've got until 8 a.m. Then I've got 90 minutes and you've got 8 hours of backup. Go do something with your hands while I work. You think better when your hands are busy. Elias lowered the phone. He stood at the edge of the tarp with the cold coming up from the asphalt and the desert dark pressing in from the edges of the fluorescent reach. And he looked at the lot, at the 400 bikes and the riders moving between them, at the Iron Covenant members he could now identify by their posture and their movement, at the others he couldn't, at the single one among them who had made a call when the boot came out and set the rest of this night in motion. He needed to find that person. He went back to Gideon. Holt had a theory. He'd been working it quietly for the last 20 minutes while Elias was on the phone, moving through the lot in the way he moved. Economical, unhurried, the road captain's read of his territory. And when he came back to the tarp, he had a name that he held with the specific careful tension of a man who is not certain and knows that not being certain matters. Ruiz, he said. Independent rider out of Flagstaff. He's been on this run twice before. This year he showed up with a different bike and different gear, which normally means nothing. Normally, Gideon said. Normally. Holt looked at his hands. His previous bike had a Desert Star sticker on the tank bag. That storage place, the chain. They've got a facility outside Kingman on 66. The Desert Star. The name of the gas station they were sitting in. The storage chain, the same name, which was a coincidence that the desert night made feel like something other than coincidence. Show me where he is, Elias said. Holt looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Elias. What are you going to do? Gideon said. Talk to him. Talking to him tells him what we know. Not talking to him tells him nothing, which leaves him in position to make another call. Elias kept his voice even. If he made the first call when the boot came out, he can make a second call the moment we move the money or change the plan. We need him out of position before we move anything. It was logistics. It was the same calculation he made when he had 3 jobs in the shop and 1 bay. Sequence matters, order matters, what you do first determines what's possible second. The mechanics of it were the same. Only the stakes were different. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Holt. Where? East end of the lot, near the highway fence. They moved. Not together, separately, with the timing of people who have thought about how they look moving. The natural and unhurried movement of riders crossing a lot for various reasons. Elias moved slightly behind Gideon and to his left, which put him in Gideon's shadow, which was where he needed to be for this because Gideon's shadow had a weight that his own didn't yet carry. Ruiz was leaning against his bike at the east fence, a cigarette burning down between 2 fingers, his phone in his other hand with the screen lit. He was maybe 45, stocky, with a beard that needed attention and eyes that registered them coming from 20 feet out and made the specific small adjustment that a person makes when they've been caught at something but haven't decided how to handle being caught. He looked at his phone. He looked at them. He put the phone in his pocket. "Gideon," he said. The greeting of a man establishing that the greeting is a normal one, that everything is normal, that there is no reason to be having this conversation. "Ruiz," Gideon said. He stopped 6 feet out. Elias stopped behind him and to the left. "Who did you call?" Silence. The cigarette burned. The desert cold moved between them. Somewhere across the lot, a burst of laughter from a group of riders made the moment briefly surreal. The normal life of the gathering continuing unaware, 20 feet from this conversation that was happening at a different temperature entirely. "I don't know what you're talking about," Ruiz said. "Yeah, you do," Gideon said. More silence. Ruiz looked at his cigarette. He looked at Elias. He looked at Gideon. Something moved behind his eyes. The calculation of a man deciding how much his position is worth and whether it's worth more than what's being implied about the alternative. "I want to know who you called and what you told them," Gideon said. His voice was the same voice he'd been using all day. Quiet, certain, without performance. The voice was more frightening for its lack of performance. "And I want to know your connection to the storage facility on 66 outside Kingman." Something shifted in Ruiz's face. Small. The shift of a man who has just understood that they know more than he expected them to know, which changes the negotiating position he'd prepared. "I got family," Ruiz said. He said it quietly. "My brother-in-law runs security for the Desert Star storage chain. He owes people. People I don't have a choice about." "The Reapers," Elias said. Ruiz didn't look at him. He looked at Gideon. "I didn't want this. I want you to understand that. I didn't want to be the one—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "They said it was just information. What clubs were running, how many riders, whether there was any—" He stopped again. "Whether there was money," Gideon said. Ruiz's eyes closed briefly. "Yeah." "What did you tell them?" "I told them about the collection, the amount." He paused. "I told them you were escorting a pickup to Phoenix in the morning." The cigarette had burned to his fingers. He dropped it. He didn't seem to feel the heat. "The image they showed you," Elias said. He came around Gideon's left, into Ruiz's direct line of sight. "The trailer cam footage from October 2022. Your brother-in-law's facility archives the footage." Ruiz looked at him properly for the first time. The look of a man reading someone he underestimated. "What did the original footage actually show?" Elias said. Ruiz was very quiet. Then quietly, "I've never seen the original footage." "But you know what it shows." Silence. "Ruiz." Gideon's voice was very quiet now. The quietest it had been all night. "A kid died on that road, 24 years old. He had a daughter." Pause. "She's 8 now. She doesn't know what happened to her father, and she's never going to know unless someone tells the truth about that road." He paused. "I'm asking you, what does the original footage show?" The desert breathed. Ruiz put his hands in his pockets. He looked at the highway beyond the fence, the dark strip of 66 going west toward Kingman, the road that held what it held and hadn't given it up in 4 years. "A pickup," he said, dark-colored, running without lights. "On the shoulder." He said it in the flat tone of something recited, something held at distance so it could be spoken. "The clip they're using, it's edited. It starts after the pickup. What it doesn't show is what came before." "What came before?" Gideon said. "The Reaper bikes," Ruiz said. 3 of them. Running the rider, the young one. Running him toward the shoulder. Pacing him. Cutting his lane. His voice was very flat. "The pickup was already there. Parked. The Reapers ran him into it." The night went silent in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Gideon stood absolutely still. He had been still in various ways all day, but this was a different stillness. The stillness of someone absorbing a fact that they have been carrying as a suspicion for 4 years and have just had confirmed, and the confirmation, rather than releasing the weight, makes it heavier because now it's real, and real is a different country than suspected. Elias watched him. Gideon's hands were at his sides. His jaw was set. His eyes were on the highway beyond the fence, and they held something that Elias didn't have a precise name for. grief and rage so old and so compressed that they'd become something third, something that wasn't either of those things anymore, but contained both. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said to Ruiz, "The original footage still exists." "My brother-in-law archived it," Ruiz said. He wasn't looking at either of them. He didn't have a choice about the Reapers getting the clip, but he archived the original because he didn't want to be responsible for destroying it. His voice dropped further. "He's not a bad man. He's a scared one." "Will he give it up?" Elias said. Ruiz looked at him. "If someone asked him the right way." "What's the right way?" "Tell him my sister knows," Ruiz said. "Tell him I said it's time." So Elias called Danny back at 11:43 p.m. with the name of the storage facility and the name of the security vendor and the specific archive server location that Ruiz had provided from his brother-in-law's system documentation, which he'd accessed on his phone in the 40 minutes since Gideon had walked him to the edge of the lot and told him quietly but absolutely to stay there and not touch his phone until he said otherwise. Danny said, "That's what I needed." "Can you get it?" "I can get to the metadata. The file itself, that's going to require someone with physical or authenticated access to the vendor's archive. The brother-in-law has authenticated access. Then I need him on the phone." Elias looked at Gideon, who was standing 10 feet away with Holt and Mason in the low conversation that had been running since Ruiz's account. He relayed this. Gideon looked at Holt. Holt took out his phone and walked toward the east fence. The next 40 minutes were the operational kind of waiting. Not the passive kind. Not the kind where you sit and endure, but the kind where everything is in motion but none of it is visible to you, where the work is happening in phone calls and server requests, and the quiet logistics of men who have decided on a direction and are executing it. Elias stood at the edge of the tarp and watched the lot and monitored Noelle through the truck windshield. She was still asleep, still breathing, the concentrator light blinking green at her feet. And he drank a fourth cup of terrible coffee that someone put in his hand without him asking, and was aware of the cold and the sound of the desert and the specific quality of the waiting that preceded something that hadn't happened yet. Mason appeared beside him at 12:19. "How are you doing?" Mason said. "I'm fine." Mason looked at him. "I'm functional," Elias amended. "That's more accurate." Mason looked at the truck. "She's good. I checked her sat at 11:95. The cool air is helping." He paused. "You've got about 7 hours before you need to be moving." "I know." "The money is distributed?" Elias touched his jacket. The cash was in 3 places. Inside breast pocket, front jeans pocket, boot. It was uncomfortable, and the boot cash made his left foot slightly uneven when he walked, and he hadn't stopped being aware of it for 1 second since he'd divided it up. "Yeah," he said. Mason nodded. He turned a coffee cup in his hands. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone moving toward something they've been deciding whether to say. "Gideon hasn't spoken about that night," Mason said. "Not to me. Not to anyone in the club, as far as I know. Not about what he believes happened." He paused. "Tonight is the first time I've heard him ask someone to account for it out loud." Elias looked at him. "Because he couldn't afford to ask before." "Because asking makes it real," Mason said, "and real requires a response. And for 4 years he hasn't had the ground to stand on for a response." He looked at the east fence where Holt was still on the phone, a small, dark shape against the highway dark. "You gave him ground." "I didn't give him anything," Elias said. "I asked a question about cameras." "You asked the question he'd stopped believing was worth asking." Mason's voice was quiet and precise. "That's not nothing. That might be everything." Elias didn't answer. He looked at the truck. At 12:57 a.m., Danny called back. "I've got it," he said. 17 minutes of continuous footage. October 14th, 2022, between 11:41 and 11:58 p.m. 3. Harley-Davidson motorcycles visible in frame approaching from the east at speed. 1 motorcycle of a different make approaching from the west. The 3 bikes converging on the single bike over approximately. He paused. He was reading from something. His voice had gone careful, the careful of a man who understands the weight of what he's reading. Over approximately 1.2 miles of footage. The single bike goes off the road at the 11:53 mark. The 3 bikes do not stop. A dark pickup truck, partial plate visible, Arizona registration, is parked on the shoulder approximately 40 meters ahead of where the bike goes down. He paused again. The pickup doesn't move. The 3 bikes are past it before it enters frame. Elias's hand was tight on the phone. The partial plate on the pickup, he said. Arizona. First 3 characters visible. KRD. Danny's voice was absolutely even. The professional flatness of someone doing a job. I can run that through the DMV records with the vehicle description. Dark-colored F-Series or similar. 2019 or newer. It'll take about 20 minutes, and it won't be official, but it'll be enough to know. Run it, Elias said. He walked to Gideon. Gideon was standing at the center of the tarp, alone for the moment, Holt and Mason both on phones at different edges of the lot. He was looking at the highway with his hands in his jacket pockets, and his face in the expression it had worn since Ruiz's account. Controlled, precise, very old. Elias stood beside him. He told him what Danny had said. He told him about the 17 minutes of footage. He told him about the 3 bikes and the timeline and the partial plate on the pickup. Gideon listened. He didn't move. When Elias finished, the silence lasted long enough that he could hear the wind moving across the highway, carrying dust and the distant smell of something dry and cold. The pickup, Gideon said. Danny's running the plate. If it comes back to a Reaper, then you have footage of 3 Reaper bikes running a rider off the road and a vehicle registered to a club member parked at the point of impact, Elias said. That's not ambiguous. That's not the kind of thing that stays unresolved in an investigation. Gideon said, The investigation is closed. Investigations get reopened, Elias said, when new evidence surfaces, when someone files a formal request with documented grounds. He paused. Danny can format the footage metadata for submission. It'll show chain of custody, timestamp integrity, unedited state. That's enough to get a reopening. Who files the request? Someone who was on this road that night, Elias said. Someone with standing. Gideon looked at him. That's me. That's you. The weight of 4 years was on Gideon's face, and he wasn't managing it anymore, not entirely. The control was still there, but it was showing its seams, the long labor of it visible in the lines around his eyes and the set of his mouth. I had a kid, Gideon said. He said it the way he'd said had a sister, the specific past tense of loss. My son. He'd have been 44 this year. He paused. I don't talk about him. I haven't talked about him in a long time. He looked at the highway. Danny Briggs, the rider we lost 4 years ago. He came to us the year after my son died. He was 20 at the time. He stopped. The word needed was doing too much work, and he seemed to know it. I was 20 years old, and he needed something he didn't have words for, and I understood that language. Elias stood very still. I couldn't save my son, Gideon said. The flatness in his voice was the flatness of a fact said too many times to have inflection anymore. He went his own way, and his own way had an end I couldn't prevent. And Danny came along, and he had his daughter, and he was building something, and I thought... He stopped again. I thought this time I got it right. This time I was in time. The desert cold moved between them. You were in time, Elias said. Someone else decided it differently. Gideon looked at him. Something in his eyes was very raw, very present. The kind of present that 4 years of management and distance had been keeping in its container, and that was now, in the middle of a gas station parking lot, in the Arizona dark, outside the container. Yeah, he said. One word. The weight of a decade inside it. Danny called back at 1:18 a.m. KRD 482, Danny said. 20 Ram Simp 500. Dark gray. Registered to a Marcus Telford. Address in Bullhead City, Arizona. A pause. Marcus Telford is listed as a member of the Desert Reapers MC in a 2021 Mojave County Sheriff's Incident Report, cited for disorderly conduct at a rally. Charges were dismissed. Another pause. The officer who dismissed the charges was a deputy named Carver, who retired from the Mojave County Sheriff's Office 8 months after the Danny Briggs case was closed. Elias's hand was on Gideon's forearm before he'd decided to put it there. It wasn't a restraining gesture. It was a grounding one, the way you ground an electrical circuit, not to stop it, but to give the current somewhere safe to go. Gideon was very still. Say that last part again, he said. His voice was completely flat. Elias relayed it. Gideon listened. The flatness in his voice when he'd asked for the repetition was the flatness of a man who understood every word perfectly the first time and needed the second pass. It's not for comprehension, but for something else, for the act of hearing it confirmed, of having it exist in the external world twice so it was undeniably real. Carver, Gideon said. You know him, Elias said. He interviewed me, Gideon said, after Danny died. He interviewed every Iron Covenant rider who was on the road that night. He was thorough. He stopped. The word professional hovered and didn't arrive. He told me personally that there was no footage from that stretch of road that night. He told me the investigation was thorough and complete and there was nothing actionable. The silence that followed was very cold. He knew about the facility, Elias said. He knew about the archive. He knew, Gideon said. Just that. Holt had come back. He was standing at the edge of the tarp, reading their faces, and he'd gone very still in the way he went still when he was recording information he was going to need. Mason came back 30 seconds later. He read the stillness and said nothing. At 1:40 a.m., the Desert Reapers came back. Not 7 bikes, 11. They came from the west this time, from the Kingman direction, which meant they'd circled around rather than using the direct return route, which meant they'd been planning the approach, thinking about the geometry of arrival. They came without haste and without hesitation, and they pulled into the west end of the lot in a line and killed their engines one after another, the sound dropping in sequence like dominoes, until the lot was left with the ambient noise of wind and the low conversations of 400 people who had all noticed, simultaneously, that the temperature of the lot had changed. Gideon watched them arrive. He didn't move toward them. He stood at the center of the tarp with his hands at his sides and his weight centered and his face carrying everything that had been put into it in the last 2 hours. The footage and the partial plate and the deputy's name and the 4 years and the 24-year-old and the 8-year-old daughter who didn't know what happened to her father. The larger Reaper, the one who'd held up the phone, got off his bike and walked toward the tarp. He walked with the ease of a man who believes he has the higher position. He stopped at the edge of the tarp's fluorescent reach. "Time's running," he said. "We've got until 8, Gideon said. Clock moved. The larger man put his hands in his jacket pockets. "We've decided we want an answer before this convoy leaves. That's 2 hours from now." He looked at the lot, at the assembled bikes, at the riders who had redistributed themselves again into the specific geometry of presence without aggression, presence as statement. He looked at the truck. He looked briefly at Elias. He looked at Gideon. 2 hours. You tell us the run is done, we go. You say no, the footage goes to Marcus Telford, Gideon said. The larger man went still. KRD 482, Gideon said. 2020 Ram 1500, dark gray, parked on the shoulder of Route 66 between mile markers 47 and 48 on October 14th, 2022 at 11:53 p.m. He said it with the precision of a man who has memorized a document. While 3 Desert Reaper motorcycles ran a 24-year-old father off the road into it. The lot around them had gone very quiet. Not the ambient quiet of people unaware of what was happening. The deliberate quiet of 400 people who had become aware in the last 30 seconds that something was occurring at the center of the lot that required them to be very still and very present. The larger man's face had changed. The ease was gone. What was underneath the ease was harder and less managed and several degrees colder. That footage doesn't exist, he said. 17 minutes of it, Gideon said. Continuous. Timestamp verified. Chain of custody documented. He paused. Marcus Telford's partial plate visible at 40 meters. Silence. Deputy Carver retired, Gideon said, but deputies who retire can still be interviewed. Journalists who are interested in the story of a 24-year-old father who died on Route 66 while bikers ran him off the road, they tend to be interested in the whole story, not just the edited version. The larger man's hands were out of his pockets now. The stillness he'd had going still but a different quality, the stillness of a very dangerous man deciding what his next move is. And the deciding was visible on his face in the specific way that violence is visible before it arrives, not in expression, but in the quality of attention, the narrowing of focus. 11 Desert Reaper bikes at the west end of the lot. 400 other riders, of whom 260 had heard enough of this conversation to understand its direction. Elias standing 5 feet behind Gideon's left shoulder with $9,430 distributed across his body and a phone in his hand with 17 minutes of video footage on a server in Medford, Oklahoma. The larger man looked at Elias. He looked at him for a long time. "Who are you?" he said. "Nobody," Elias said. "I'm just passing through." Something moved in the man's face that wasn't quite a smile, wasn't anything that had warmth in it. "You're going to wish you'd kept passing." "Probably," Elias said. The larger man looked at Gideon. "This isn't done." "No," Gideon said. "It's not." He said it without performance, without heat, the certainty of a man who understands exactly what he's committed to. "But tonight it's done. Take your bikes off this lot." The silence stretched to its limit. And then, from somewhere in the assembled 400, not from the Iron Covenant specifically, not from any identifiable source, but from the general body of riders who had been on this run and on this road and had heard enough, someone started a bike. One engine, then another. Not the Iron Covenant, the multi-club riders, the independents, the other clubs who'd been part of this run for years, or who'd joined for the first time this season and didn't know the full history, but understood the present moment with the clarity of people who have spent their lives reading the present moment on open roads. They started their engines one after another, not in a rush, not with aggression, with the particular deliberate pace of a statement being made collectively and without hurry. By the time 40 bikes were running, the sound in the lot was significant. By the time 80 were running, it was a physical thing, not deafening, not the full roar of the convoy at speed, but the low, sustained, layered rumble of engines that were on and present and not going anywhere. 400 riders, one lot, engines running in the Arizona dark like a held breath that had decided it wasn't going to be held much longer. The larger reaper looked at his 11 bikes and at the 400 engines and at Gideon, who had not moved, and did the mathematics that the situation required. He turned. He walked back to his bike. He mounted up. He said something to the rider beside him, too low to carry, and then he started his engine and the 10 other Reaper engines started with his, and they pulled out of the west end of the lot in their line and rode back onto Route 66, and the sound of them diminished into the desert dark. The engines around the lot idled for another 30 seconds. Then, one at a time, they began to shut down. The lot went back to its ambient sound, its normal temperature, its ordinary darkness. Elias stood at the edge of the tarp with his heart hitting the inside of his chest at a rate that he was very aware of, his breath coming in the short burst pattern of a body that has been holding itself at readiness for a confrontation that had resolved without contact and was now, in the absence of the confrontation, releasing the held readiness all at once. His hands were shaking. He made them stop. Gideon turned and looked at him. They looked at each other in the fluorescent wash of the Desert Star gas station at 1:53 in the morning, surrounded by the cooling metal and leather of 400 motorcycles, with 17 minutes of footage on a server in Oklahoma, and a partial plate and a retired deputy, and the full weight of 4 years of something that had finally been said out loud. Gideon said, "You need to sleep." "I'm fine." "You've been fine all day," Gideon said. "You're not fine. You're running on something that's going to run out before Phoenix if you don't sleep." He looked at the truck. 2 hours. The lot's not going anywhere. Nobody is going anywhere. He paused. "I'll be here." Elias looked at him. Something about the way he said, "I'll be here." The specific, quiet certainty of it. The same certainty he'd been using since he crouched down to the asphalt beside a kid who'd collapsed at the bumper of a dying truck and hadn't asked why, hadn't asked for anything, had just come down to the same level. Something about it did what the last 12 hours had been doing to the rigid, held thing inside Elias's chest. The thing he'd been carrying for 8 months and 3 days and 22 years and the whole long distance from Medford to this parking lot. "Yeah," he said. He walked to the truck. He opened the passenger door quietly and checked Noelle's levels. 96, steady, her breathing slow and regular. And then he reclined the driver's seat and lay back and looked at the headliner for about 4 seconds. Then he was asleep. He dreamed about engines. Not the broken kind. The kind that run. The steady, purposeful, perfectly timed firing of a rebuilt engine finding its rhythm. The sound of something that had been wrong being right again. The specific and irreplaceable satisfaction of a machine restored to what it was supposed to be. He didn't know that outside, while he slept, Gideon Vale sat on the hood of his truck with a cup of cold coffee and watched the highway and the dark. He didn't know that Mason checked Noel's oxygen levels 4 times in 2 hours and noted them in the small notebook he carried, and that every number was steady. He didn't know that Holt spent those 2 hours on the phone with a lawyer in Phoenix who specialized in wrongful death cases, and who, when presented with 17 minutes of footage and a vehicle registration and a retired deputy's name, said in a very level voice that he would be in his office at 7 a.m. and that someone should call him then. He didn't know that at 3:14 a.m., a dark gray Ram pickup drove slowly past the lot on Route 66 going east, slowed briefly at the entrance, and then accelerated and continued east toward Kingman without stopping. He didn't know that Gideon watched it pass. He didn't know that Gideon's hands, resting on his knees on the hood of the truck, were absolutely still. What he knew was the dream of engines. And when Mason woke him at 3:45 a.m. with a hand on his shoulder and a cup of coffee that was somehow hot, and said quietly, "It's time," the engine sound from the dream followed him up into the waking world, and it took him a moment to understand that the sound wasn't from the dream at all. It was real. It was all 400 bikes, already running, already warm, already pointed toward the highway. He sat up. He looked through the windshield. The lot was in motion. Not chaos, not rushing, the deliberate and organized motion of 400 riders who have decided on a direction and are moving toward it with the collective intention of people who have done this 1,000 times and know exactly what it costs and have decided to pay it anyway. Chrome catching the fluorescence and the first gray suggestion of pre-dawn light on the eastern horizon, leather and exhaust, and the smell of coffee from someone's thermos and the cold desert air that would be warm again in 2 hours, but was cold now, cold and clear, and carrying the sound of the engines like something cupped in both hands. Gideon was at the passenger window. Elias rolled it down. "You ready?" Gideon said. Elias looked at Noelle. She was awake, had been awake for a few minutes, was sitting up with the pulse oximeter on her finger and her eyes bright with something that wasn't exactly alertness, but was something adjacent to it. The brightness of someone who has woken up to find that the world is different than it was when they closed their eyes, and the difference is not worse. She looked at Elias. She looked at Gideon. She looked at the lot full of running engines. "Ready," Elias said. Gideon put his hand briefly on the doorframe, one hand flat, the gesture of a man concluding something, and then he stepped back and walked toward his bike. Elias started the truck. The engine caught on the first turn, smooth. The temperature gauge came up to normal and held. The belt ran silent. The water pump moved coolant through the system with the steady, purposeful efficiency of a thing correctly repaired. He put it in drive. Ahead of him, at the lot entrance, Gideon's bike pulled out onto Route 66 and turned west toward Phoenix, and behind him the convoy began to move, and the sound of 400 Harley-Davidson engines finding road gear at the same moment rolled out across the Arizona desert like thunder that had been waiting all night for the permission to become itself. And Elias Mercer pulled his truck into the line and followed the man with silver hair into the last dark before dawn, carrying his sister and $9,430 and 17 minutes of footage and the specific, fragile, irreplaceable weight of a day that had changed every calculation he'd ever made about what it meant to survive alone. And he held 60 miles an hour on the rebuilt engine, and the night opened ahead of him like a road that had been there all along, waiting for him to be ready to drive it. The convoy hit the I-17 interchange at 4:51 in the morning. Elias knew the moment they crossed from the old highway onto the interstate because the road surface changed under the tires. Smoother, wider. The engineered certainty of a road built for speed rather than character. And because the sound of the convoy changed with it, 400 engines finding a higher gear simultaneously, the collective note rising and spreading across the flat dark of the pre-dawn valley like something that had been contained and was now allowed to be its full size. Noelle was awake beside him. She'd been awake since the lot. She hadn't spoken much, not from exhaustion, or not only from that, but from the same quality of attention she brought to the naturalist's book, the careful, present attention of someone who understands that certain things only happen once and deserve to be fully inhabited while they're happening. She watched the convoy through the windshield, the long chain of headlights curving ahead of them in the dark, chrome catching the glow of the occasional highway lamp, and she was quiet in the way of someone who is full rather than empty. She had the pulse oximeter on, She had the concentrator running. She had Elias's flannel shirt over her own shirt and a blanket from behind the seat that had been in the truck since Medford and smelled like motor oil in old winters. She looked, in the dark cab with the dash lights reflecting in her eyes, like herself. Not the managed, careful version of herself that the last 14 months had produced. Not the version that monitored and conserved and rationed her own energy, like someone aware of a fixed supply. But the version that had existed before the diagnosis and that had not, it turned out, been entirely consumed by it. The version that could look at 400 motorcycles on an Arizona highway in the last dark before dawn and feel the full weight of it without needing to protect anyone from her feeling it. She said, "Elias." "Yeah, I love you." She said it simply, not dramatically, the way you say a true thing to someone when the context has stripped away all the reasons you usually don't say true things directly. He kept his eyes on the road. The red taillights of Gideon's bike were directly ahead, steady at 65 miles per hour, holding the lead position the way he'd held it all day. Quietly, certainly, without announcement. "I love you too," Elias said. She put her hand on his arm and left it there, and they drove. The Phoenix skyline appeared at 5:43 as a low, ambient orange on the southern horizon. Not the skyline itself, but the light of it, the city's exhalation rising into the pre-dawn sky and staining the dark to the south with the particular industrial glow that large human gatherings produce, visible from 40 miles out if the air is clear, which Arizona air is, in the early morning before the heat builds and the particulates rise. Noelle saw it first. She always saw things first. She said, "There it is." Elias saw it. He breathed. Behind them and ahead of them, the convoy stretched in both directions as far as the headlights reached. A moving city of chrome and leather and engine heat, 400 people who had woken before dawn or hadn't slept, who were riding toward a hospital entrance on an August morning because a silver-haired man had said one word in a parking lot 15 hours ago, and the word had moved through 400 people like current through a completed circuit. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him. He glanced at it. Danny Rice. A text. Lawyer confirmed receipt of footage package. Formatted for submission. He says call him at 7. He says it's enough. Elias read it twice. He put the phone back on the seat. He thought about Marcus Telford's dark gray Ram parked on a highway shoulder at 11:53 p.m. on October 14th, 2022. He thought about 3 bikes running a 24-year-old into it and not stopping. He thought about a retired deputy named Carver and a closed investigation and 4 years of Gideon Vale returning to the same road with the same question and no ground to stand on while he asked it. He thought about an 8-year-old girl who didn't know what happened to her father. She would know. Not today, not tomorrow, not without the kind of time that legal processes require and the kind of patience that grief demands. But the footage existed, the lawyer had it, the chain of custody was documented, and the shape of what had happened on Route 66 on that October night was no longer a shape only the Desert Reapers controlled. That wasn't everything. It wasn't justice. Not yet. Not in the complete and final sense. But it was the beginning of the infrastructure of justice. And sometimes the beginning was the hardest thing to build. He thought about Gideon sitting on the hood of the truck at 2 a.m. watching the highway. He thought, now he has ground. Phoenix Valley Medical Center appeared at 6:47 a.m. It was a large campus on the north side of the city, multiple buildings, the main tower visible from the highway, the campus roads lined with the particular institutional landscaping of places that have been built for serious purposes and maintain their grounds with the care of an organization that understands that the appearance of order matters to people who are already frightened. The parking structures were half full at this hour, early staff arrivals and night shift vehicles, the low buzz of a medical complex that never completely stops. The convoy did not go into the parking structures. It lined the approach road. Gideon led them in from the highway access, and then, with the particular precision of a man who had looked at the map and planned the arrival, directed the line of bikes onto the broad campus road that ran alongside the main entrance. A road wide enough for the convoy to fill both shoulders without blocking traffic, and fill it they did. Bike after bike pulling in and stopping in sequence, engines dropping to idle and then to silence as each rider found position, until the approach road to Phoenix Valley. Medical Center's main entrance was flanked on both sides by 200 Harley-Davidsons per side, their riders dismounted and standing, a corridor of leather and chrome in the early morning light. Elias pulled the truck through the corridor they'd created. He drove slowly, not because he needed to. The road was clear, the entrance ahead, but because something about driving through it at speed would have been wrong, would have missed the point of it in a way he couldn't fully articulate but understood completely. He drove at the pace of someone who is arriving somewhere that matters and knows it. The riders on both sides didn't look at the truck. They faced forward, toward the entrance, their backs to the road. Not at attention in any military sense. Loose, individual, the stance of 400 separate people who had independently chosen the same posture, facing the hospital, standing between it and whatever the world behind them contained. Noelle was looking out the passenger window. Her hand was over her mouth and her eyes were very bright, and she was doing the thing she did when she was managing something larger than she had room for. The very still face and the very bright eyes and the controlled breathing that was partly the concentrator and partly something else. "They don't have to," she started. "Yeah," Elias said. "They do." She put her hand down. She looked forward through the windshield at the hospital entrance getting closer. He pulled up to the main entrance circle and stopped. Gideon was already there. He'd taken a different route in, faster, the bike's advantage, and was standing at the entrance doors holding one open, just that. Standing there in his road-worn vest and his decades in his gray eyes, holding a hospital door open at 6:51 in the morning like it was the most ordinary thing he'd ever done. Elias turned off the engine. The truck ticked in the silence. He got out. He came around to Noelle's side and opened the door, and she gathered herself the way she always did. The small internal organization, the breath, the balance. And she took his hand and stepped down. She was carrying her own bag. He reached for it. She didn't let him have it. "I've got it," she said. He let her have it. They walked toward the entrance together. Gideon held the door. Mason was inside already, which meant he'd ridden fast and ahead, and he was at the reception desk with something in his hand. A folder, which turned out to contain a printed copy of every document Elias had assembled for this appointment, organized and tabbed, which was something Elias had not asked him to do and had not known he'd done. The intake coordinator was a young woman who had clearly been briefed that a convoy was arriving because she didn't look out the window at the 200 bikes on both sides of the approach road with surprise. She looked with something that was more like awe, briefly, before her professional composure reasserted itself. "Noelle Mercer?" she said. "Yes," Noelle said. "We've been expecting you." She looked at the folder Mason produced, glanced at the tabs with the quick efficiency of someone who knows exactly what she needs to see. "Everything looks to be in order. Dr. Vasquez is in at 7. She'll be ready for you shortly." She looked at Elias. "Are you family?" "Her brother," he said. "You're welcome to wait in the family area. It's just—" "He knows where it is," Mason said quietly from behind them. "He'll find it." The coordinator looked at Mason. Something in his bearing, the medic's bearing, the specific combination of competence and calm, made her accept this without further question. She led Noelle toward the intake hallway. Noelle went 3 steps and stopped. She turned around. She looked at Mason first, looked at him for a moment with the clear, tired eyes, and then she reached out and put her hand briefly on his forearm and said, "Thank you." 2 words. The weight of the whole night in them, and the whole day before it, and the 8 months before that. Mason said, "Get well." She looked at Gideon. Gideon was still holding the door. He wasn't going to let go of it until she was through. She understood that. And he understood that she understood it, and neither of them made anything of it, just held the simple transaction of the held door between them. She said, "Mr. Vale." He said, "Ms. Mercer." She said, "I don't know how to say it." He said, "You don't have to." She looked at him for a long moment. In that look was everything she might have said, the gratitude and the something beyond gratitude, and the specific feeling of a person who has been failed by every system designed to support them and has been caught, unexpectedly and completely, by something that operates outside those systems, something that runs on a different kind of fuel entirely. All of it in the look. No words required. She nodded once. She turned and walked into the hospital. Gideon let the door close. The lawyer called at 7:03. Elias was in the family waiting area, a room with the particular institutional comfort of places designed to make waiting bearable, which meant it was clean and quiet and not quite warm enough, with chairs that were acceptable, and a coffee machine that produced something in the general category of coffee. He answered on the first ring. The lawyer's name was Gutierrez. His voice was the voice of a man who has been doing this work long enough to have stopped being surprised by the contents of cases and started being surprised only by the quality of the evidence. He said the footage was, in his assessment, sufficient basis for a formal request to reopen the investigation into Danny Briggs's death. He said the vehicle registration connecting Marcus Telford to the scene, combined with the Mojave County Sheriff's Association with Deputy Carver and the Reapers, constituted what he termed a meaningful pattern of investigative failure. He said he had a contact at the Arizona Department of Public Safety who handled oversight cases of this nature and who was, in his experience, genuinely motivated by them. He said, "This won't be fast." "I know," Elias said, "and it won't be clean. These things never are. The Reapers have resources and they'll use them. Carver will have a lawyer before the week is out. The footage will be challenged on technical grounds and we'll respond to those challenges, and it will take time." "Okay. But it's real," Gutierrez said. "It's documentable. It's the kind of case that, when it finally resolves the way it should." A pause. "That young man's family deserves that." "Yeah," Elias said, "they do." He ended the call. He sat for a moment in the not-quite-warm family waiting area with the cup of institutional coffee going cold in his hand and the quiet of the early hospital morning around him. The particular quiet of a building in which serious things happen calmly, in which the urgency of the interior is insulated from the outside world by intention and design. He called Gideon. Gideon picked up on the third ring. His voice was the same voice. No indication of where he was or what he'd been doing in the 40 minutes since the entrance, simply present, ready. Elias told him what Gutierrez had said. He told him about the Arizona DPS contact and the reopening and the timeline. He told him it would take time and wouldn't be clean. Gideon was quiet for a moment after. Then he said, "Danny's daughter, her name is Lily. She lives with her grandmother in Prescott." "I know," Elias said. He didn't know. He hadn't known that until this moment. He said it anyway, because somehow it felt like the right response to the name and the place and the specific human fact of an 8-year-old girl in Prescott who had a grandmother and no father and was about to enter a world in which what had happened to him was going to begin, slowly, to be accountable. "Tell the lawyer her grandmother's name is Patricia Briggs," Gideon said. "If there's a victim's family notification process, it goes through her." "I'll tell him." Silence. Not empty silence, the full kind, the kind shared between two people who have been through something together and are standing on the other side of it and haven't found the language yet for what the other side feels like. Gideon said, "You should eat something." Elias looked at the cold coffee. "I know. There's a diner on McDowell Road, 2 miles east. Good eggs, bad coffee." A pause. "We'll be there for a while. When Noel's settled. Come find us." "You're staying," Elias said. It came out slightly wrong, so not a statement, not quite a question, the register of a person who has not yet fully updated their model of the world to account for how it has changed. "We're on a rally," Gideon said. "We've got time." Another pause. "Come find us." Noel's evaluation took 4 hours and 40 minutes. Elias knew this because he was in the waiting room for all of it, mostly sitting, occasionally standing at the window that looked out over the parking structure, once going to the coffee machine for a second cup that was no better than the first. He ate a granola bar from the bag in his jacket pocket and looked at his phone and looked at the window and looked at the door that Noel had gone through and did not look at his watch because looking at his watch in situations like this had never once made time move faster. At 9:12 a.m., Mason appeared in the doorway. Elias looked at him. "She's been accepted," Mason said. The words landed simply and completely, the way that true things land when they've been earned by the full weight of everything that came before them. Not with drama, just with presence, the fact of it taking up the space it deserved. Elias sat with it for a moment. Then he put his face in his hands and held it there for a count of 10, and in those 10 seconds he allowed himself to feel the entirety of the last 14 months in the privacy of his own palms. The insurance forms, and the form letters, and the Albuquerque parking lot, and the Amarillo shop, and 3 days of no sleep, and $67, and the water pump, and the radiator steam, and the boot full of money, and the footage, and the deputy's name, and the dark gray ram on the highway shoulder and all of it, the whole accumulated weight of forward motion sustained past the point where forward motion made rational sense. He let himself feel all of it for 10 seconds. Then he lifted his face. His eyes were wet. He didn't make anything of it. Mason was looking at him with the steady, calm attention of a man who has watched people receive news, good and bad, both kinds, for many years, and has learned that the right response to either is simply to be present for it. Dr. Vasquez says the trial's Phase 2 results have been promising, Mason said. She said Noelle's profile aligns well with the patients who have responded. She was careful about it. She's a careful person. But she said hopeful, and she meant it. She said hopeful. She said hopeful. Elias stood up. He needed to move. He walked to the window and looked at the parking structure and breathed for a moment. Mason, he said. Yeah. Your kit. Last night at the lot. The nebulizer, the clinical oximeter, the blood pressure cuff. He turned from the window. You carry all of that on a motorcycle. Mason looked at him with the faint expression that he sometimes wore when a question revealed how much was still unknown between them. I'm a medic, he said. I've been a medic for 31 years. You carry what you need. In case, Elias said. In case, Mason agreed. How often does it... He stopped, reframed. How often does the club run into people who need it? Mason turned the coffee cup in his hands. More than you'd think. Less than we'd like to be ready for. And we're always as ready as we can be. He looked at the door Noelle had gone through. This last year, we helped a woman outside Flagstaff whose car had broken down with 2 kids and a job interview in 3 hours. Fronted a veteran outside Winslow money for medication he couldn't afford. Sat with a man outside Gallup for 2 hours while he decided whether to call his son, which he hadn't done in 9 years. He paused. He called. Elias looked at him. This is what we do, Mason said, simply. Without performance or explanation. The statement of a man who has arrived at the understanding of what his life is for and has stopped needing anyone else to validate that understanding. It's not organized. It's not official. We don't have a name for it, or a protocol, or a mission statement. He paused. We just pay it where it's owed. Gideon's words. The same words. And underneath them, the station owner in Seligman in 1971, and underneath that, whoever had told him, and underneath that, the chain of it going back further than any of them could trace, the long informal inheritance of people choosing to carry what they find rather than stepping over it. Noelle appeared in the doorway at 10:23. She looked tired in the specific way of someone who has undergone 4 hours of evaluation, the productive tiredness, the tiredness of effort rather than depletion. She had a folder in her hand with the Phoenix Valley Medical Center logo on it. Her oxygen concentrator was at her feet, carried by a young intake nurse who handed it off to Elias with a nod and retreated. She looked at her brother. He looked at her. First treatment cycle starts in 2 weeks, she said. I have to come back on the 14th. They gave me a contact for patient housing assistance. There's a program for out-of-state participants. She paused. Dr. Vasquez says the first 3 months will tell us a lot. Okay, he said. She said hopeful. Noelle said it carefully, with the precision of a person who has been careful with that word for 14 months and is only now allowing herself to handle it with less caution. She meant it. I know, he said. Mason told me. Noelle looked at Mason. She said, You were monitoring me all night. 4 times, Mason said. 95 was the lowest it got. She absorbed this. The full scope of it. What it meant that a man she'd met 15 hours ago in a gas station parking lot had checked her oxygen saturation 4 times while she slept, had noted the numbers in a small notebook, had carried the clinical knowledge to know what the numbers meant, and the commitment to act if they changed. Thank you, she said. The same 2 words she'd given him at the entrance, but different now. Fuller, with more of what was behind them visible. Mason nodded. He didn't deflect it or minimize it. He received it the way people should receive genuine thanks, which is with stillness and acknowledgement, neither more nor less than what it was. There's a diner, he said. Gideon wants eggs. McDowell Road Diner had been open since 1962, according to the sign, and it looked it, not in a state of disrepair, but in the particular well-worn state of a place that has been continuously inhabited by people who needed food and warmth and a surface to put their coffee cups on for long enough that the wear is a form of character rather than neglect. Booths with red vinyl, slightly cracked at the seams and repaired with care. A counter with stools. Windows that caught the morning light at a low angle and spread it across the linoleum floor in long, dusty bars. The Iron Covenant had taken over the back half of the diner. Not all 400 riders. The convoy had dispersed after the hospital, most heading for rest or fuel or the continuation of the rally route. But 20, 25, the core of them, the ones who'd been under the tarp in the Desert Star parking lot and on the phones in the Arizona dark and standing in the approach road as an honor guard at 6:50 in the morning. Gideon at the end booth. Holt across from him. Bobby and Dex at the next table. Others whose names Elias had collected in fragments throughout the night, settling into the specific ease of people at rest after significant effort. Not relaxed exactly, but decompressing, the particular unwinding of held attention. They came in, the three of them, Elias with his hand under Noel's elbow for the step up from the curb, Mason slightly behind. The diner did something when they entered, not theatrically, not with applause or noise or any of the things that would have been wrong. The conversations didn't stop, the coffee cups didn't go down. It was subtler than that, a kind of collective orientation, a turning of attention that was quiet and complete, the acknowledgement of people who have been through something together that they see you on the other side of it, and you see them, and that's enough. Gideon looked up from his coffee. His eyes went to Noelle first. She met them. He said, "How'd it go?" She said, "They accepted me." He nodded, once. The nod of a man receiving information that he'd decided was going to be the case and is satisfied to have the decision confirmed. "Sit down," he said. "Eat something." They sat. Bobby pushed a menu across from his table without being asked. The waitress appeared, a woman in her 50s who had been navigating the space between the Iron Covenant and the booths of early morning regulars with the practiced ease of someone who had seen all varieties of human being pass through her diner and had formed the professional opinion that all of them needed coffee and most of them needed to eat. She looked at Noelle. She looked at the oxygen concentrator. She looked at Elias with the specific reading that some people do. Not diagnostic, just attentive, the assessment of someone trying to understand what she was dealing with so she could be useful. She said, "What do you need, honey?" Noelle said, "Coffee, eggs, whatever's fast." The waitress made a note. She looked at Elias. "You?" "Same," he said. "Please." She looked at his hands, at the grease that was still in the lines of his knuckles from the parking lot work, at the general state of him, which was the state of a man who had not slept properly in 3 days and had spent one night in the desert and was now sitting in a diner booth at 10:40 in the morning, looking like the last page of a long chapter. She made another note and didn't say anything and went to fill the coffee. Gideon said, "The lawyer." "He called at 7, Elias said. "He has the footage. He's filing for a reopening." He looked at Gideon across the table. "He said it won't be fast." "Nothing true is," Gideon said. "He needs Patricia Briggs's contact information, Lily's grandmother." Something moved in Gideon's face. Through the old lines of it, through the 50 years of road and loss and forward motion, through the specific weight of 4 years of a question he'd finally been able to ask. The movement was very small and very complete. "I'll call her," he said. "I'll tell her myself." Elias nodded. "She's been waiting," Gideon said. Not to anyone. Just placing the fact in the air between them, where it could be what it was. 4 years. She's been waiting for someone to tell her it was real, what she believed happened. He looked at his coffee. She deserves to hear that it's real. The diner moved around them. The clatter of plates, the sound of other conversations, the waitress navigating the space with the ease of long practice, the morning light coming through the windows at its low angle and warming everything it touched. Holt said, without looking up from his own coffee, "Ruiz." "He told us what he knew," Gideon said. "He called them in the first place." "He told us what he knew," Gideon said again. The same words, slightly different weight. The weight of a man who has decided something and is done discussing it. Holt was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. The acceptance of a second who trusts his president's read even when his own instinct runs differently. The eggs arrived. Simple and hot, and exactly what they were. Eggs, toast, the kind of food that exists to refuel rather than to delight, and which is more valuable for that than any delicacy could be at this particular hour and in this particular state of being. Elias ate. He ate with the focused, unselfconscious attention of a body that has finally been given permission to acknowledge what it needs. He ate most of it before he looked up. Noelle was eating too, more carefully and more slowly, but eating. She had the folder from the hospital open on the table beside her plate, not reading it, just open, the way you keep something near you when you need to know it's real. Dr. Vasquez's contact card was clipped to the inside cover. Across the diner, someone had put quarters in the jukebox. An old country song came through the speakers, the kind with pedal steel and a voice that had lived in it, the kind that sounds like roads and distance and the specific loneliness of American geography at its most beautiful. It was not too loud. It was exactly loud enough. Mason was drinking his coffee and looking out the window at the McDowell Road morning, the city waking up, the traffic building, the particular quality of Phoenix light at this hour, already warm, already promising the heat that would arrive by noon. He had the small notebook in his front pocket. He hadn't put it away. Bobby was telling Dex something about a carburetor. The conversation was technical and quiet and completely ordinary. Dex disagreed about something and said so with the flat certainty of a man who has been wrenching for 30 years. Bobby waved his fork. The conversation continued. Elias looked at all of it. He looked at the booth, and the eggs, and the coffee, and the morning light, and the 23 people in the back half of a Phoenix diner who had spent the night doing what they did on a road between nowhere and somewhere, and he felt, sitting in his own body, in his own life, on the morning of the day his sister had been told there was hope, something that he had no clean word for and didn't need one. It was enough to feel it. It was, in fact, more than enough. They left the diner at noon, not all at once, in ones and twos, the way people leave when there's no ceremony planned and none needed. Someone settles their check, someone else gets up. The group disperses by the natural attrition of people who have somewhere to go and are ready to go there. Handshakes. Brief, real. The handshakes of people who have been through something rather than the handshakes of people being introduced. Bobby clapped Elias on the shoulder hard enough to mean something. Dex handed him a business card that said Iron Covenant Mechanics with a Flagstaff address and phone number, and, in handwriting on the back, call if the belt gives you trouble again. Holt shook his hand without words, which was how Holt seemed to communicate everything that mattered. Mason was last. He stood with Elias on the sidewalk outside the diner while Noelle was finishing her coffee, and the McDowell Road traffic moved past them, and the Phoenix heat was beginning its daily commitment to being itself. Her follow-up is the 14th, Elias said. 2 weeks. I know. It's 1,500 miles. I know that too. Mason looked at the truck, parked at the curb, the fixed water pump, the new belt. The truck that had arrived at the Desert Star gas station dying and was now, by every mechanical standard, sound. You'll make it. Elias looked at him. He looked at the road captain patches, the medic's bearing, the notebook in the pocket. He looked at the man who had checked his sister's oxygen saturation 4 times in the desert dark without being asked and had spent the night fixing what needed to be fixed with the same calm attention he brought to everything. Mason, he said. Yeah. Danny Briggs. He said the name carefully because it deserved care. You knew him. Mason was quiet for a moment. The specific quiet of someone choosing how to hold something before they open it. He called me the summer before he died, Mason said. He was having trouble, not physical trouble, the other kind. The kind that you don't have language for when you're 24 and the world has been harder than it told you it was going to be. He paused. We talked for a long time. He had something in him. A particular kind of honesty, the kind that costs something to have because you can't pretend your way past a situation when you're honest with yourself about what the situation is. He looked at the truck. He was going to be something. He already was. Elias said, I'm sorry. Yeah, Mason said. Me too. They stood in the morning heat and the traffic moved and the city went about its business around them with the complete indifferent efficiency of cities. Then Mason said, Take care of her. I will. Take care of yourself too. He said it with the directness of a man who means it as medicine rather than sentiment. Not second, Not when there's time left over, at the same time. Elias looked at him. He understood what Mason was actually saying, understood it the way he hadn't understood anything anyone had told him about this in the last 14 months. Because everyone who'd said something similar had said it in the language of advice, and Mason said it in the language of diagnosis, which was different because you can dismiss advice, but diagnosis is what's true. Yeah, he said. Mason put out his hand. Elias took it. The handshake was brief and solid and complete. Mason walked to his bike. He put on his helmet. He started the engine, and the Harley's voice filled the space between the buildings the way it filled every space. Fully, without apology, with the specific authority of a machine that knows what it is. He pulled out into McDowell Road traffic and was gone. Gideon was the last one at the diner. He was standing beside his bike when Elias and Noel came out. Not leaning against it, standing beside it the way a rider stands beside a bike, that they've had long enough that the relationship between them is not about the bike, but about the road they've shared. The helmet was in his hand. The silver hair was loose from the cord, moving slightly in the hot wind that had begun to build from the south. Noel went to him directly. She wasn't the kind of person who asked permission for things that felt right. She stopped in front of him and looked up at him. She was shorter than him by 8 inches. And then she put her arms around him and held on. He was still for a moment, not from stiffness or surprise, from the specific stillness of someone receiving something they haven't been given in a long time and are allowing themselves to have. Then he put one arm around her shoulders, briefly, the way you hold something that is both significant and not yours to keep. She pulled back. She looked at him. "I'm going to be okay," she said. She said it the way she'd said it across the kitchen table in Medford when they were 17 and 12 and their mother had left. Not a promise, not a prediction, but a decision. The decision of a person who has chosen their direction and is going in it. Gideon looked at her. In his gray eyes was everything the last 20 hours had put there and everything the last 4 years had put there and something else underneath all of that. Something that had been in him before all of it. Something that was the original version of this man before the road, and the losses, and the accumulated weight. Something that was just, at its base, the willingness to be present for other people's lives. "I know," he said. She nodded once. She went to the truck. Elias stood in front of Gideon. He had things to say. He'd been constructing them in various forms throughout the morning. In the waiting room, at the diner, on the sidewalk, while Mason talked about Danny Briggs. Versions of thank you, and I don't know how, and I will repay this, and you changed everything. All the various formulations of a truth too large to fit in any single sentence. He looked at Gideon, and the sentences dissolved. What was left was simpler than any of them. "The man in Seligman in 1971, he said. "Did you ever see him again?" Gideon shook his head. "I went back once, 10 years later. The station was a different business. Nobody there knew him." He paused. "That's how it works, mostly. You don't get to close the loop. But you kept paying it." "I kept paying it," Gideon said. Elias looked at the road. The Phoenix traffic, the morning heat, the city going on. He thought about the version of this day that had been probable before the Desert Star parking lot. The water pump failing on the highway, the truck stopping, the appointment missed, the door closing. He thought about what that version of the day would have cost. He thought about an 8-year-old girl named Lily in Prescott, with a grandmother named Patricia and a father she was going to learn the truth about, slowly and imperfectly, and in the legal language that these things require, but learn. He looked at Gideon. "When I find the person," he said, "when I'm in time, I'll tell them who to thank." Gideon looked at him. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not with sentiment, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching something complete. A circuit closing. Current moving the way current is supposed to move. "Tell them the man in Seligman says it's paid," Gideon said. Elias nodded. He put out his hand. Gideon took it. They held it for a moment longer than handshakes usually last, the extra beat of it carrying the weight that words hadn't been able to carry. Then Elias walked to the truck. He got in. He started the engine. Smooth. The rebuilt water pump moving coolant through the system with quiet efficiency, the belt running clean, the temperature gauge sitting steady in the normal range. He looked in the rearview mirror. Gideon was putting on his helmet. He mounted his bike with the ease of a man who has done it 10,000 times, who belongs on a machine the way some people belong on roads, completely, without effort, as if the movement is what he was built for. He started the engine. In the mirror, the Harley's exhaust note filled the frame briefly, the deep, layered voice of it, the particular sound that had been rolling across the American desert since before either of them had been alive. And then Gideon pulled into McDowell Road and was gone. Elias watched the rear view until the bike was out of sight. Then he looked at Noelle. She was looking at the hospital folder in her lap. The contact card was in her hand. She was reading Dr. Vasquez's phone number the way you read something you intend to memorize. Not quickly, with full attention. She looked up. "Ready?" he said. She put the card in her shirt pocket close. "Yeah," she said. He put the truck in drive. They pulled out onto McDowell Road and headed north, toward the I-17, toward Oklahoma, toward Medford, and the shop and the engines waiting to be fixed, and the ordinary life that would be different now in every way that mattered without being different in any way that was visible. The Phoenix morning spread around them, hot and clear, and indifferent in the way of cities, which hold every human story equally, and remember none of them. The road opened ahead, long and flat, and pointed toward a horizon that the heat shimmer had not yet risen enough to dissolve. Noelle put her hand on the window glass. It was already warm from the sun. "Tell me something," she said. He looked at the road. "What?" "Something true." He drove for a moment. The engine ran steady under him, the rebuilt pulse of it, the water pump moving coolant through the system on its repaired circuit, everything in its place and working as it should. "We made it," he said. She turned her face to the window. The desert was out there, huge and ancient and patient, the same desert that had been there for the last 3 days of driving and would be there for the next 3. And in the middle distance, barely visible, already disappearing into the heat shimmer, a single Harley-Davidson was moving east on a road that ran parallel to the interstate, chrome catching the morning light, engine note too far away now to hear, but present in the way that things are present after they've passed through a space and left their shape in it. Noelle watched it until it disappeared. Then she settled back in the seat and closed her eyes and breathed, in and out, the concentrator hissing softly at her feet, the pulse oximeter on her finger, her brother's truck running solid and true under the wide-open Arizona sky. She breathed. The road carried